The stone was still there. Eudora Kendrick pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and stared at the tiny, smooth piece of gray creek rock sitting on the outer ledge of her windowsill, and she felt something inside her chest crack clean open like a split log. She had been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of dust and rattling stagecoach wheels and the suffocating grief of burying her mother in a churchyard 3 counties east. 6 weeks of sleeping in strange beds and eating food that tasted like nothing and telling herself she was fine. She was managing. She was holding herself together. And every single morning she had been away, someone had placed a new stone on her windowsill. She knew it was not the same stone. She could tell by the subtle differences, the variation in color, in weight, in the smoothness of the edges. Some were pale quartz, some river-dark basalt, some freckled with flecks of mica that caught the early light like scattered sparks. A different stone, every morning, for 6 weeks. She pressed her forehead to the glass and squeezed her eyes shut, and the tears she had been holding back since the moment she stepped off the stage came flooding out of her all at once, hot and uncontrollable, because she understood with devastating clarity what it meant. It meant someone had stood outside her window every morning at dawn, in the summer heat and the thunderstorms and the days when the Red Canyon dust turned the sky orange, and had chosen a stone with care, and had placed it there like a kept promise, like a declaration, like a love letter written in the only language they thought they were allowed to use. She knew exactly whose hands had done it. Eudora turned from the window, her breath shaking, and she pressed her palm flat against her sternum as though she could hold her own heart in place, because the truth of the matter was far more complicated than the sweetness of the gesture, far more forbidden, far more tangled up in secrets she had been carrying for the better part of 2 years, secrets that involved a man who looked at her like she was the first sunrise he had ever seen worth waking up for, and a past so dark and layered with betrayal and forced choice that neither of them had dared reach across the distance between what they felt and what they said. Micah Hudson. And what made it impossible, what made it the kind of secret that could ruin everything, was that Micah Hudson was not just a man she admired from a careful distance. He was a widower with 3 children. He was her nearest neighbor. He was the man who had, on the night she arrived in Red Rock Gulch 2 years ago with 1 trunk and no husband and a letter of intent to claim her late uncle's homestead, stood on her porch in the rain and said, without ceremony or sentimentality, that if she ever needed anything she only had to say so. She had needed things. She had never said so. And now she was standing in her kitchen in the early gray light of a September morning in 1882, weeping over a small gray stone, and the story of how she had arrived at this moment was the most honest and terrifying story she knew. Red Rock Gulch, New Mexico territory, had not been Eudora's first choice of destination. It had not been her second, either. She had been 26 years old when her uncle Reginald Kendrick died intestate and left his homestead claim to the only surviving member of the family willing to fight for it. Eudora had been living in St. Louis at the time, working as a seamstress in a shop that smelled of cedar and linseed oil, sharing a boarding house room with a woman named Clara who snored like a freight engine. She had a modest life, and no particular complaints, and no burning desire for adventure. But she had also had a letter from a county clerk in New Mexico territory, informing her that if no heir presented themselves within 90 days, the land would revert to territorial ownership. And she had $104 in a tin box under her bed. And she had a stubbornness that her mother had always called both her greatest virtue and her most reliable curse. So she had packed her trunk and bought a stage ticket and traveled 400 miles into a landscape that looked like God had taken a hammer to the earth and left it where it fell. And she had arrived in Red Rock Gulch on a Wednesday afternoon in late April of 1880, with the stage dust still on her skirt and her hat knocked sideways, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. What she was walking into was a homestead that needed a new roof, a well that needed cleaning, 3 acres of scrub land that needed clearing before any planting could begin, and a neighbor named Micah Hudson who appeared on her porch that very first evening with a covered pot of venison stew and 2 of his children in tow. She remembered that first moment with the kind of precision that only came from having replayed it in her mind several hundred times in the years since. The light had been going gold over the canyon rim, and she had opened her door to his knock and found him standing there with his hat in one hand and the pot in the other, and she had thought, with absolutely no warning or permission, "That is the most honest face I have ever seen on a man." He was 32 at the time, lean and sundark from years of outdoor work, with gray already threading through his brown hair at the temples and deep-set eyes the color of weathered oak. He was not conventionally handsome, not in the way the men in the illustrated papers were handsome, but there was something in the way he held himself, the way his gaze was direct without being aggressive, the way the lines around his eyes suggested he had both laughed and grieved with equal sincerity that made him impossible to look away from. "Micah Hudson," he said, "my place is the one with the red barn half a mile east. My wife, Eleanor, she would have wanted to welcome you herself. She passed last winter." The grief in those words was measured and restrained, the grief of a man who had learned to carry it without letting it spill on everyone around him. Eudora had accepted the stew and learned the children's names, and by the end of that first evening she had understood 3 things with absolute certainty. First, that Micah Hudson was a deeply good man. Second, that he was still grieving and not remotely ready for anything complicated. Third, that she was already, helplessly, beginning to care about him in a way that was going to cause her a great deal of trouble. She had been right about all 3. The first year in Redrock Gulch was consumed entirely by survival. Eudora was not a woman who had worked the land before, and the learning curve was brutal. She cracked 3 fingers in her first week trying to work the pump. She ruined 2 batches of bread before she understood the elevation affected the baking. She burned herself on the iron stove so many times in the first month that she gave up counting the scars on her wrists. The roof leaked in 3 places until Micah came over one Saturday in July with a ladder and his eldest son, and spent 4 hours fixing it without asking her permission or accepting her offer of payment. She had stood at the base of the ladder holding it steady while he worked, and they had talked for those 4 hours about everything and nothing, about the territory, about St. Louis, about whether the creek that ran behind her property would sustain a kitchen garden, about his children, about what she planned to do with the land long term. And she had understood by the end of it that talking to Micah Hudson was the easiest thing she had ever done, which was unusual, because Eudora was not by nature an easy conversationalist. She was guarded and precise, and she thought before she spoke, and she had always found small talk a minor form of torture. With Micah, there was no small talk. There was only the real kind. His children became part of her life by degrees, the way creek water found its way into low ground. The eldest was Samuel, who was 12 when she arrived, and quiet and watchful and sharp-minded in a way that reminded her of herself. The middle child was a girl named Ruth, who was 9 and inclined to loudness and strong opinions, and had her father's direct gaze and her mother's reportedly fierce temper. And the youngest was a boy named Daniel, who was 5 when Eudora arrived, and who had the kind of open, uncomplicated affection for the world that very young children have before the world teaches them caution. Daniel was the one who started bringing her things. It began in her first autumn, when he appeared at her door one morning with a yellow wildflower he had found by the creek, then a piece of red clay shaped vaguely like a horse, then a beetle's wing casing, iridescent green. He never explained these offerings. He simply held them out, serious-faced and solemn, as though they were important communications requiring no further context. Eudora accepted each one with equal solemnity, and she kept them in a small wooden box on her windowsill, which she suspected Daniel knew, because his offerings always seemed calibrated to fit there. By Daniel's 6th birthday, she had become, without any formal announcement, something in the nature of an aunt to all three Hudson children. She mended Samuel's coat when the sleeve came apart. She argued good-naturedly with Ruth about whether horses or mules were more sensible. She read to Daniel on the evenings when Micah was occupied with work and could not get through bedtime alone, which happened more often in that first year than she suspected Micah was comfortable admitting. And all of this time, she and Micah maintained between them a scrupulous, almost painful propriety. They were neighbors. They helped each other in the way neighbors helped each other in this part of the territory, where the nearest town was 8 miles of rough road and the nearest doctor was 20 miles beyond that. They talked. They shared meals occasionally, usually with the children as a buffer. They never touched except for the practical necessities, a steadied ladder, a handed-over pot, the time he caught her arm when she slipped on icy porch steps in January of her first winter. That moment, the catch of his hand on her arm, the brief solid contact of his grip steadying her, had lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She had thought about it for 2 weeks. Because what neither of them spoke about, what sat between them with the solid, immovable presence of something that could not be wished away, was the fact that the feeling between them was not neighbor feeling. It was not friendly regard or mutual respect or the comfortable warmth of community. It was something that had no business existing, something that Eudora had tried to name, and then decided naming it was more dangerous than leaving it nameless, something that made the air in a room change when they were both in it. She suspected he felt it too. She suspected this with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who knew herself well enough to recognize when she was not imagining things. But Micah Hudson was a man with 3 grieving children and a raw, recent loss, and a code of behavior so internally consistent that she could not imagine him allowing himself to act on anything that wasn't fully examined and fully chosen. So they orbited each other, careful and constant, for 2 years. And then Eudora's mother got sick. The letter came on a Thursday in late July of 1882, forwarded through 3 different towns before it finally reached Raydrock Gulch. Her mother, widowed for a decade and living with Eudora's older sister Clara in Kansas, had taken a fever that had settled into her lungs and was not, according to the doctor's note appended to Clara's letter, expected to recover. Eudora read the letter twice, folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and went about her day with the methodical precision of a woman who knew that if she stopped moving she would fall apart. She did not fall apart until that evening, when she was sitting alone at her kitchen table after dark with a cup of tea gone cold, and then she wept for an hour without stopping, quiet and contained, so that no one would hear. She arranged her passage the next morning. She had a few dollars set aside, enough for a stage ticket and modest board while she was away. She put her garden in the care of the closest thing she had to a friend in Raydrock Gulch, a Mexican woman named Lupe Vasquez who lived 3/4 of a mile south and whose family had been on this land for 3 generations before any American settler had arrived, and who had, with considerable patience, taught Eudora how to make tortillas and how to read the sky for coming weather. She told Micah she was leaving. She told him on a Friday evening when she stopped by his place to return a borrowed hand drill because she had been avoiding what she needed to say and she was tired of her own cowardice. She found him at the workbench in his barn, working on a fence post by lamplight, and she stood in the barn doorway with the drill in her hands and the evening air warm around her shoulders, and she said, "My mother is dying. I have to go to Kansas. I don't know how long I'll be." He set the post down and turned to look at her, and the look on his face was something she had no adequate word for. Not pity, she was grateful for that. Not the awkward condolence of someone who didn't know what to say. Something quieter and more certain than either of those things. "Is there anything you need before you go?" he asked. "Your well is deeper than mine," she said, which was not what she had meant to say. "Lupe will water the kitchen garden, but she can't do it every day. If it gets too dry, I'll see to it," he said. She nodded. She thanked him. She left. She did not let herself look back as she walked home, because she knew if she saw him standing in that barn doorway watching her go, She would not be able to maintain the composure she was using every available reserve of self-control to hold together. The journey to Kansas was long and grinding. The stage broke down twice. She arrived to find her mother smaller and grayer than she remembered, already half-translated out of this world, and she sat by the bed and held her hand and talked to her about small things, the garden, the canyon colors at sunset, the funny, serious way Daniel Hudson delivered his offerings, because those were the things that felt most real to her now, most home. Her mother died on a Sunday morning 12 days after Eudora arrived. Clara arranged the burial. Eudora stood at the graveside in the August heat and felt the particular hollow weightlessness of a grief that had been anticipated, but was no less devastating for the anticipation. She stayed for another week to help Clara sort through their mother's effects, and then she began the long journey back. And the whole time she was gone, 6 weeks in total, she had of course not known about the stones. She had not known that every morning, just before dawn, a small boy named Daniel Hudson had gotten out of his bed, crossed the half-mile of scrubland between his father's house and hers, and placed a stone on her windowsill. A different stone each time, carefully chosen from the creek bed or the canyon walls, or wherever his morning walk happened to take him. She had not known this until she returned and counted the accumulated evidence of it, 27 stones in a careful line across her windowsill, because Daniel could not reach the entire ledge from the ground and had apparently employed some creative solution, possibly an upturned bucket, to leave each one in sequence. 27 mornings, 27 promises. And now she was standing in her kitchen with tears on her face and a certainty in her chest that she could not ignore any longer, because the stones were not from Daniel alone. She knew that. She knew it with the same bone-deep certainty she had about everything she had been refusing to acknowledge for 2 years. The stones were from Daniel, but the intention behind them, the deliberate, daily faithfulness of the gesture, the fact that someone had made sure a 7-year-old boy had a bucket to stand on and the encouragement to keep going, that was Micah. She washed her face. She put on her best day dress, the dark blue calico with the small white collar. She braided her hair. She was not a woman who spent a great deal of time on her appearance, but today felt like a day that required a kind of armoring. She walked the half-mile to the Hudson place. The morning was clear and sharp. The September sky, the deep blue that only came after a run of hot days, had finally broken, and the canyon walls to the west were burning copper in the early light. She crossed her own fenced land, and then the unfenced scrub between, and came up the low rise to the Hudson yard, where the red barn stood, and smoke was already rising from the kitchen chimney, and she could hear the sound of someone chopping wood around back. She went around back. Micah was there, working through a pile of logs with a methodical efficiency, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps on the dry ground, and something moved across his face. A succession of things actually, surprise and relief, and something much more complicated underneath both, and he set the axe down with deliberate care. "You're back," he said. "I am," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. "How is your mother?" he asked, and then stopped, and something shifted in his expression. "I'm sorry." That was a thoughtless question. "She passed," Eudora said, 3 weeks ago. "I'm sorry, Eudora." Her name in his mouth always did something particular to her equilibrium, and she straightened her spine against it. "The stones," she said. He went very still. "Daniel left stones on my windowsill," she said. "Every morning, 27 of them." Micah said nothing. He was looking at her with that direct, uncalculated gaze of his, and she could see the careful control he was maintaining, and she could see, beneath it, everything he was controlling. "Micah," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Did you send him?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "No," he said. "He went on his own the first morning. He told me when he got back. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was making sure Miss Kendrick knew that someone was thinking about her." A pause. "I walked him over each morning after that, to make sure he was safe on the road." Eudora pressed her lips together. She would not cry again. She had done enough of that. "Why didn't you leave one yourself?" she asked. The question was direct, and she knew it, and she did not take it back. Micah picked up the axe and set it against the log pile, not because he needed to, but because he needed somewhere to put his hands. Because, he said slowly, I wasn't sure I had the right. And now, he looked at her. Eudora. Micah, she said. I have spent 2 years being very careful. I am tired of being careful. I would like to know, plainly, if what I believe to be true is true. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and she thought for a moment he was going to say something, some measured, considered thing, the way he always said things. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, both hands, holding them in his with a gentleness that was also unmistakably a claim, and he said, "It's true," she exhaled. "I should have said so a year ago," he continued, and there was something rough and honest in his voice, something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "I told myself it wasn't right. That it was too soon, that the children weren't ready, that you deserved someone with fewer complications. I told myself a lot of things." "I know," she said. "I was telling myself the same things. Were they convincing?" "Not remotely." He laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, and the laugh changed his whole face, and she fell in love with him a little more in that exact moment, which she had not thought was possible since she was fairly confident she had already fallen completely. "There's something I have to tell you," she said, because the honesty that had gotten her this far demanded she finish the job. "There's a reason I was not merely careful. There's a reason I kept more distance than just propriety required." He was still holding her hands. He did not let go. "My husband," she said, and felt him go still. "My first husband, I mean. We were married for 4 years before I left St. Louis. Tobias Reeve. He was not," she chose the words carefully, "he was not a good man in private. He was a fine-seeming man in public and not a good man at home. I left him in 1878. I took the name Kendrick back, which was my mother's family name. I came here in 1880 to start over." She watched him take this in. "He won't come looking," she added. "I know that. He remarried inside the year, which I know because a friend of my sister's wrote to tell me. I am not legally his wife anymore. The territory court granted a dissolution in 1879 on grounds of abandonment, and he did not contest it because contesting it would have raised questions he didn't want raised." "Did he hurt you?" Micah asked. His voice was quiet. Not angry, not yet, just precise. "He was the kind of man," she said, "who knew how to make a person feel small without leaving marks. It took me a long time to understand that was its own kind of damage." The understanding on his face was immediate and complete, and she realized she had been afraid he wouldn't understand, that he would look at her with confusion or discomfort or some well-meaning but useless suggestion that it could not have been so bad. He looked at her with none of those things. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I thought you deserved to know what you're—" She paused. "What you're considering." "I'm not considering," he said. "Considering implies uncertainty." She looked up at him. "I have been certain about you," he said, "since approximately the 3rd conversation we ever had, which I believe was about whether creek water was safe for a kitchen garden. And I was furious with myself about it for months because the timing was terrible and the circumstances were complicated, and you seemed, most of the time, entirely content not to be looked at that way." "I wasn't content," she said. "I was frightened. Of me. Of wanting something again," she said honestly. "Of being wrong again. Of building something and having it taken apart." He lifted one of her hands and pressed it briefly, formally, against his lips, and the gesture was so old-fashioned and so sincere that it undid something in her chest that she had not known was still knotted. "I'm not Tobias Reeve," he said. "I know," she said. "I have known that from the first evening." "Then let me ask you something, and I'd like you to think about it before you answer." "All right. Would you be willing to come to supper on Sunday, with me and the children, not as the neighbor," as he stopped, trying to find the word, "as someone you're courting," she offered. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." The word courting felt both ridiculously formal and exactly right, and she smiled at him, the first full and uncalculated smile she could remember giving him, and said yes. The courtship of Eudora Kendrick and Micah Hudson proceeded with a care and intentionality that surprised everyone. including themselves. It was not a fast or reckless thing. They had both lived enough to know that the things worth having required time and patience, and the willingness to see clearly rather than to project what you hoped onto what was actually there. So they took the time. Sundays became standing arrangements. Conversations that had always been good became deeper and more honest, stripped of the careful distance they had maintained for 2 years. They talked about Elena, Micah's wife, whom Eudora had never known, and whom he spoke about with a quiet love that was also fully at peace, the grief transformed by time into something more like a treasured weight than an open wound. "She would have liked you," he said one Sunday evening when the children had gone to bed and they were sitting on the porch steps with the canyon going purple in the dusk. "She had no patience for nonsense and a great deal of patience for people who deserved it. She would have recognized you." "I think I would have liked her too," Eudora said honestly. "She left me a letter," he said, "to be opened when I was ready to." He paused. "When I was ready to think about a future again. I read it last November." "What did it say?" "She said don't be so stubborn about being strong that you forget you're allowed to be happy." Eudora was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she knew you very well." "She did." He reached over in the dark and found her hand, and she turned her palm up and held on, and they sat like that until the stars came all the way out and the coyotes started their distant conversation across the canyon. And it was one of the best evenings of Eudora's life without anything dramatic happening at all. The children were another matter entirely and required a separate kind of navigation. Samuel, now 14, was watchful and reserved in the way that eldest children of grief sometimes were, taking on a small and unnecessary, but deeply felt version of the parents' responsibility for the family's well-being. He had been polite to Eudora from the beginning and had always respected her, but polite and respectful was not the same as easy, and she knew it would take time. Ruth, 12 now and increasingly her own very particular self, was the more direct challenge. Ruth came to Eudora one afternoon about a month into the changed nature of things and stood in front of her in the kitchen with her arms crossed and said, "Are you going to marry my father?" Eudora set down the bowl she was holding and gave Ruth her full attention because Ruth at 12 deserved nothing less. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "We're still getting to know each other in that way. Why do you ask?" "Because I want to know what's happening," Ruth said. "Nobody tells me anything because they think I'm too young and I'm not." "You're right," Eudora said. "You're not too young to know that your father and I have become more than just neighbors, and that I care about all of you a great deal, and that anything that happens will be talked about openly before it's decided." Ruth studied her for a long moment with those evaluating dark eyes. "My mother used to say that a woman who tells the truth even when it's complicated is worth trusting. Your mother sounds like she was very wise." "She was." Ruth uncrossed her arms. "I don't mind," she said, which from Ruth was approximately the equivalent of enthusiastic endorsement. Daniel, who was now 7 and who had started this entire chain of events with his careful daily devotion, had no complicated feelings about it at all. When Micah sat the children down together and explained with characteristic straightforwardness that he and Miss Kendrick were courting and that everyone should feel free to ask any questions they had, Daniel's response was to nod once very seriously and say, I knew it would work." "What would work?" Micah asked. "The stones," Daniel said, as though this should have been obvious. Micah looked at his youngest son for a long moment. "What exactly did you think the stones would do?" "Tell her," Daniel said simply, "that somebody was thinking about her, that she wasn't gone and forgotten." He looked at his father with the particular clear logic of a 7-year-old who had worked something out very carefully. Because if she came back and knew somebody had been thinking about her every single day, she'd know it was safe to stay. Wouldn't she? Micah was quiet for what felt like a long time. "Yes," he said finally, "she would know that." When Eudora heard this account, relayed to her by Micah the next Sunday with the particular wonder of a man who had just realized his youngest child was perhaps wiser than him in some important respect, she had to excuse herself for a moment and stand in the kitchen collecting herself before she could come back and sit down, because the idea that Daniel had engineered this with full intentional purpose was almost more than she could absorb with composure. She went to the creek the next morning and spent half an hour selecting the most perfect stone she could find, a smooth piece of pale quartz with a single gray vein running through it like a signature, and she gave it to Daniel with a gravity that matched his own and told him it was a thank-you gift. He put it in his pocket and nodded once. Then he asked if she was going to be his mother now. She looked at him. She said, "I would like to be if that would be all right with you." He considered this. He said yes. The question of marriage was raised by Micah 3 months after the Sunday supper courtship began, on a cold November evening when they were both in her kitchen and the fire was burning low and the wind was pushing hard against the shutters. He did not make a grand declaration of it. He was constitutionally incapable of grand declarations, which was one of the things she most appreciated about him. He simply said, while they were washing up dishes after supper, "I'd like to marry you, Eudora. If you're willing." She set the dish down. She turned to look at him. "I've been thinking about it for some time," he continued, "and I don't want to wait any longer to ask because I've spent 2 years not saying things that should have been said and I'm done with that approach." "So am I," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her, the first real kiss between them. And it was everything that 2 years of careful distance had been accumulating toward, warm and certain and completely without pretense. And she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with the full weight of everything she felt. They married on the first Saturday of December, 1882, in the small church in Red Rock Gulch, with Samuel and Ruth and Daniel sitting in the front pew and Lupe Vasquez standing beside Eudora as her witness, and the Reverend Thomas reading the service in a voice that suggested he approved of the whole business. Ruth cried, which surprised everyone including Ruth. Samuel shook Micah's hand afterward with a formality that was so adult and earnest that it made Micah's eyes go bright. Daniel gave them each a stone, 1 stone each, smooth and river-polished, because he had decided this was the appropriate wedding gift and he had put considerable thought into the selection. Eudora wore her blue calico dress and pinned a sprig of dried sage to her collar, because it was December and fresh flowers were not to be had. She braided her hair and left it pinned up rather than down. She was not nervous. She had been nervous about enough things in her life to know the difference between anxiety and excitement, and what she felt walking into that small church was purely, cleanly the latter. Micah was waiting at the front in his good coat and his best hat, which he removed the moment she came through the door, and held against his chest in a gesture that looked almost involuntary. He watched her walk up the aisle with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt the usual stability of the floor under her feet become briefly uncertain. The ceremony took 20 minutes. The promises felt like the most real thing she had ever said. The life they built together afterward was not perfect, because no life was, but it was good in ways that she had not allowed herself to fully imagine before she had the safety of actually living it. Moving into the Hudson house was a negotiation of small details and unexpected feelings. The house was larger than her homestead cabin, with a real parlor and a proper kitchen and 3 bedrooms. She brought her own things, her books, the small wooden box of Daniel's early offerings, her sewing chest, and the curtains she had made herself for her windows. Integrating them into a space that still held the ghost of Alina's particular arrangements required a sensitivity she tried to exercise without making it labored. Micah gave her full authority over the kitchen and parlor, which she reorganized methodically and without excessive sentiment. He was not a man who attached ownership to objects, and she appreciated that. The one exception was Alina's rocking chair, which lived in the corner of the parlor and which she left exactly where it was, because it was Samuel's favorite reading chair, and there was no reason to change that. She took on the mothering of the children with the same honest directness she brought to everything else she did. She did not try to erase Alina from the household. She did not try to make the children feel guilty for their continued grief, which resurfaced at unpredictable times and in unpredictable forms. Ruth's sudden fury on a Wednesday afternoon for no apparent reason, Samuel's silence that could last days, Daniel's occasional solemn announcement that he missed his mama, delivered with the calm certainty of a child who had processed this as a fact of his world rather than a wound. She held Daniel when he said those things. She listened to Samuel during his silences, which mostly meant leaving books where he would find them and making sure there was always something warm on the stove. She argued with Ruth when Ruth wanted to be argued with, which was often, and held her corner with the firmness Ruth seemed to need from her, the proof that Eudora was not going to be run off by a 12-year-old's testing. She loved them, not as a replacement for something else, not as an extension of her love for their father, but as their own particular complicated selves. She loved Daniel's formal solemnity and his instinct for exactly the right gesture at the right moment. She loved Ruth's ferocity and her secret softness, and the way she looked after both her brothers with a fierceness she would have denied under oath. She loved Samuel's quiet and his reading, and the slow, gradual way he began, over months, to include her in conversations he didn't have with anyone else. And she loved Micah with a depth and ease that still occasionally surprised her, because she had spent so long living with the shadow of what love had looked like the first time that it was startling to discover it could be this fundamentally different. Loving Micah was not frightening. It did not require her to be smaller or quieter or more careful than she was. It did not come with conditions or fluctuate with mood or require constant interpretation. He was steady and certain and honest, and he loved her in a way that was plain and demonstrable, and she had not understood until she had it how much she had needed exactly that. He brought her coffee in the mornings before she was fully awake. He asked her opinion on everything from fence repair to what to do about Samuel's growing interest in possibly attending school in Santa Fe when he was 16. He listened to her. He laughed with her. He came to her in the evenings with the day still on him, dusty and tired, and she found that she was genuinely glad every single time to see him come through the door. They still had difficult conversations. She had not expected it to be without those. There was a conversation in February of 1883, 3 months into the marriage, about the homestead she still technically owned. The county land office had been sending notices about her uncle's original claim, and there was a man named Gerald Pratt who had been making arguments through the county clerk that the claim was improperly filed and should revert to him, based on some claimed adjacency right that Eudora was fairly certain was invented whole cloth. Pratt was a land speculator who had bought up 2 other properties in the county in ways that had left the original owners with nothing, and his interest in her 40 acres was not about farming. Micah's first instinct, which he stated plainly and then stopped himself before fully committing to, was to go talk to Pratt in person. Eudora's response to that was equally plain. "No," she said. "Eudora, Micah," she said. "The land is in my name. It is my business to handle. I am not asking you to stay out of it. I'm asking you to follow my lead in it. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. Tell me what you want me to do." What she wanted him to do was take her into town to the county clerk's office and stand beside her while she filed a formal counter-objection to Pratt's claim, citing the original documentation she had in her possession. She had found her uncle's original filing paperwork in the bottom of her trunk when she arrived, and she had the good sense to have kept it all this time. The county clerk reviewed the documentation and confirmed, after a consultation that took 2 hours and required the production of a territorial land survey map that the clerk had to locate from a back room, that Eudora's claim was sound, and Pratt's adjacency argument was without legal basis. Pratt himself appeared at the clerk's office during this process, which she had not anticipated, and attempted to make his case directly to the clerk with the well-practiced confidence of a man who had found that confidence usually worked. He ignored Eudora almost entirely, which was an error in judgment. She waited until he finished, and then she placed her uncle's documentation on the counter and said, clearly and without aggression, "The original claim dates to 1874, with continuous improvement recorded through 1880 and subsequent assignment to my name confirmed by the county court in April of that year. Mr. Pratt's adjacency claim applies only to unimproved land, and the improvement record disqualifies it. I believe Mr. Plum has the survey." Pratt turned to look at her, apparently only just noticing she was a person who spoke and held documents. The clerk produced the survey. Pratt's claim dissolved under the evidence with the particular deflated anger of a man who had expected easier opposition. Micah said not a single word throughout this entire process, and she appreciated that more than she could adequately express. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, he said, "You are a formidable woman, Eudora Hudson." The first time she heard her new name said aloud like that from his mouth was a thing she filed away to remember always. "I know," she said. "Do you mind?" "No," he said. "I would have been disappointed to find out otherwise." Spring came to the canyon country with a particular extravagance that year, as though the land itself was making up for the long, cold winter. The creek ran high and fast and clear, and Eudora's kitchen garden, now properly established and expanded with a second growing bed she and Micah had built together in March, pushed up green and determined from the warmed soil. She grew beans and squash and onions and a border of calendula along the east side that served no practical purpose except to be orange and cheerful, which she considered reason enough. Daniel turned 8 in April and received, among his birthday gifts, a small pocket knife that Micah gave him with a serious talk about its responsibilities, and a book of illustrated natural history from Eudora that he proceeded to carry everywhere for the next 2 months. He was at the age of intense classification, wanting to know the name of every bird and insect and plant formation he encountered, and Eudora found herself drawn into conversations about taxonomy that were some of the better intellectual exchanges she'd had since arriving in the territory. Samuel, 15 now, had decided he wanted to apprentice with the land surveyor in Reed Rock Gulch, a man named Whitfield who did territory surveys for the county and occasionally for the railroad. Micah and Eudora talked about this at length, weighing it seriously, and ultimately decided that an apprenticeship was a reasonable path and a skill that would serve him well. They made the arrangement with Whitfield in May, and Samuel began spending 2 days a week in town learning land measurement and cartography, and the change in him was visible almost immediately, a direction to lean into, a sense of his own future taking shape. Ruth turned 13 and became, if anything, more completely herself, which was saying something. She had inherited her father's work ethic and her mother's reportedly volcanic temperament, and she had added to these her own particular stubbornness, which exceeded both, and her fast and careful intelligence, which she deployed selectively and strategically. She and Eudora had settled into a relationship that was not quite mother and daughter, and not quite anything else that had an existing name, something that was specifically theirs, characterized by mutual high standards and occasional genuine argument, and an underlying affection that neither of them was especially inclined to make sentimental. Ruth came to Eudora in June and said she wanted to learn to read the legal documents that Eudora had used to defeat Pratt's land claim. Eudora said, "All right." She spent the summer teaching Ruth how to read territorial statute. It was the beginning of something that would continue for years. In August of 1883, Eudora told Micah she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, after the children were in bed, with the lamp burning low and the smell of wood smoke still in the air. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, and she watched his face change through surprise and then something so nakedly joyful that she felt her own chest expand with it. He crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her, which was his characteristic response to significant emotion, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt him breathing steadily against her hair, and she thought about how small and unlikely this whole story had been, this man and this kitchen and this particular canyon at the edge of the world, and how precisely and completely right it felt. "Are you well?" he asked, leaning back to look at her. "Perfectly well," she said. "Though I suspect the next few months will be educational." "They will," he agreed. He had done this 3 times before, and he had the calm competence of a man who knew what was coming and was not alarmed by it. "I'd like Lupe Vasquez to attend the birth," Eudora said. "She has more experience than the doctor in Red Rock Gulch, and I trust her more." "Whatever you want," he said, without hesitation. What she wanted, it turned out, was mostly to continue working at her normal pace for as long as possible, which she did, because the pregnancy was uncomplicated and she was healthy, and the work kept her grounded. She continued the legal studies with Ruth. She continued the kitchen garden. She continued riding out with Micah on Saturdays to check the fence line, though they switched her horse for the quieter of the 2 mares at his insistence, which she agreed to after confirming that he was making the suggestion on practical grounds, and not on any misguided belief that she needed to be wrapped in cotton. The baby came in a late April snowstorm in 1884, which was the kind of unpredictable weather the high desert was capable of. Warm spring one day and 6 inches of snow the next. Lupe was there, and Micah sat outside the bedroom door the whole time with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and the children sat with him. Ruth and Daniel pressed against each side of him and Samuel a little apart but not far, and they waited through the hours of it together, and when the cry came, thin and indignant in the new quiet after the storm, Daniel said, with the certainty of someone reporting a confirmed fact, "I knew it would be all right. It was a boy." Micah named him Isaac. Eudora approved the name and noted that it meant laughter, which seemed exactly right. The first months of Isaac's existence were exhausting and beautiful and occasionally alarming, all the things Eudora had been warned about, and all the things no warning could adequately prepare you for. She had not known she would feel that particular ferocious tenderness, that sudden comprehension of how much of oneself could be contained in something that weighed less than a sack of flour. She had not known that watching Micah with a new infant would be one of the more devastating things she had ever witnessed. The ease of it, the naturalness, his big hands holding the small body with such effortless care. Daniel was enchanted by Isaac in a way that reminded her of Daniel himself at 5, the same serious wonder about a small, fragile thing. He brought Isaac his first gift at 3 days old, a tiny smooth stone, white and perfect, which he placed on the edge of the cradle with great ceremony. Ruth held Isaac with the wariness of someone who knew this was important and was not going to drop it for the world. And gradually the wariness softened into something that looked, on Ruth, like adoration, expressed in her characteristic way through fierce protectiveness, and the periodic announcement that he was, when he wasn't screaming, actually quite nice. Samuel asked to hold his new brother once and did so briefly and carefully, and then handed him back, and said, "He has your eyes," to Eudora, which was the most personal thing Samuel had said to her in 2 years of shared household, and which she received with the full appreciation it deserved. Micah watched her with Isaac and said one evening, very quietly, "I didn't know it was possible to love watching someone do something as much as I love watching you with him." She looked up from the nursing infant and said, "Don't make me sentimental. I'm already functioning on 3 hours of sleep." He laughed and brought her tea. Isaac grew the way children grew, in the abrupt lurches of early childhood where one day they are one thing and the next morning they are inexplicably another thing entirely. He walked at 11 months and spoke his first clear word at 13, which was Daniel's name, said with the delighted recognition of someone greeting their most reliable companion. Daniel, upon hearing this, sat down next to Isaac on the rug and informed him with great gravity that this was a good choice. The homestead property was eventually resolved in full. Eudora and Micah decided together that rather than let it sit unused, They would work the land as an extension of the Hudson operation, using the additional 40 acres for expanded grazing. They made the arrangement formal through the county land office, which now had a clerk who had replaced the previous one and who was, thank goodness, considerably more efficient. The land Pratt had tried to take sat green and useful in the canyon valley, and every time she rode the fence line of it, Eudora felt a satisfaction that was only partly about the practical value of the acres. By the winter of 1885, Samuel was 16, and his apprenticeship with Whitfield, the surveyor, had turned into something that was closer to employment than apprenticeship. Whitfield had offered him paid work on a territorial survey commission that would take him east of Red Rock Gulch for several weeks. The family sat down together to discuss it, including Ruth, because Ruth at 14 had opinions about everything and expected to be consulted, and including Daniel, who was 9 and took family meetings very seriously. Samuel went on the survey commission. He came back 3 weeks later with stories and payment and a confidence in himself that was new and good to see. Ruth decided, that same winter, that she wanted to be a lawyer. She announced this at supper with the characteristic directness that meant she had thought about it for a long time and was not announcing it to ask permission, but to inform everyone of a decision already made. Micah looked at her for a moment. Eudora kept eating. "The territorial bar," Eudora said, "accepts application from anyone who can pass the examination and has the required study credentials. Women have applied and been admitted in other territories." "I know," Ruth said. "I've already written to the court office in Santa Fe to ask about requirements." Micah set down his fork and looked at his daughter, and then at Eudora, and then back at his daughter, and something moved across his face that was equal parts pride and the somewhat disconcerted awe of a parent whose child has exceeded his best projection. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" What Ruth needed was books and time, and someone to continue the legal reading education that Eudora had started in the summer of 1883. What she eventually got was all of that, and a correspondence with a woman in Santa Fe named Harriet Gallegos, who was herself studying law and who became Ruth's first adult friend outside the family, and a fierce and particular determination that no one who knew Ruth for 5 minutes could have doubted would eventually arrive at its destination. 1986 brought another pregnancy, which announced itself to Eudora in March with a certainty that she recognized from Isaac's early months. She told Micah with less ceremony this time, not because she was less glad but because they had found their own shorthand for important things. "Again," she said at breakfast. He looked up. Understood, set down his coffee and smiled at her with the particular slow warmth that was uniquely and entirely his. "Daniel," he said, "is going to be unbearably pleased with himself." "Why?" "He told me in February that there would be another baby before summer." She stared at him. "How did he know?" "He said," Micah reported with total seriousness, "that he could tell by the way the creek was running." She looked out the window at their youngest child, who was currently crouched by the fence observing something on the ground with his natural history book open beside him. "What does that mean?" "I have genuinely no idea," Micah said, but he was right. This pregnancy was also healthy and uncomplicated, and Lupe Vasquez attended again, and the baby arrived in November of 1886, a girl this time, born on a morning when the first real frost had silvered the canyon grass, and the light had that particular winter clarity that made everything look sharp and true. They named her Eleanor. Not as a wound or an obligation, but as a gift, a way of saying, "This family holds all of its love, the past and the present, and it is not less for holding more." The 3 older children received this name choice with a range of responses. Samuel said nothing for a long moment and then nodded once, the way he nodded when something had touched him and he wasn't going to discuss it. Ruth said, "That's right," in the tone of someone confirming a correct answer. Daniel looked at the sleeping baby and said, very softly, "Hello, Eleanor." He had brought a stone for her already. Of course he had. He placed it in the corner of the cradle, and it occurred to Eudora that Daniel Hudson was simply a person who marked the important things in the world with small, careful gestures, and that this had been true of him from the beginning, and that it would probably be true of him always. She picked the stone up and held it in her palm. River quartz, pale gray with a white vein. Smooth. Perfect. She thought about 27 stones on a windowsill. She thought about a 7-year-old boy who had decided that the best way to tell a woman she was not forgotten was to leave a physical promise each morning of her absence. She thought about the father who had walked his son through the dark each morning to make sure he arrived safely. She thought about how all of this, the whole enormous, complicated, beautiful thing that her life had become, had started with a pot of venison stew in a golden evening light and an honest face, and the specific rightness of feeling genuinely seen. She had been afraid for so long. Afraid of wanting, afraid of trusting, afraid of building something that would be taken apart again. She had built walls with the same determined efficiency with which she had cleared her homestead land, and she had been proud of her walls, and she had not understood until Micah Hudson that the point had never been to stop building, only to build the right things. She put the stone back in the corner of Eleanor's cradle, next to her sleeping daughter's small curled hand. Christmas of 1886 was the fullest the house had ever been. Lupe Vasquez came with her 2 grown daughters and her grandson, who was Daniel's age and who and Daniel conducted an extended and silent collaboration in the corner of the parlor, involving a collection of rocks and some string that never fully revealed its purpose. Samuel was home from a surveying contract that had taken him south of Santa Fe for 2 months, and he had brought everyone gifts: a tobacco tin for his father, a length of blue ribbon for Ruth, a handful of river stones from a different county for Daniel, and for Eudora a small leather-bound book of botanical illustrations that he had found in a shop in the city. "I thought you might like it for the garden," he said, handing it over with the careful offhandedness of a 16-year-old who was not going to make too much of the gesture. She held the book and looked at him. "Samuel," she said, "thank you." Something in the directness of it seemed to reach him. He met her eyes. He said, "You've been good to us, to all of us. I don't say that enough." "You say it when it matters," she said. "That's enough." It was more than enough. It was, in its way, everything. The table that Christmas was crowded and loud and warm, and Micah sat at one end of it with Isaac in his lap and Eleanor asleep in her basket behind his chair, and Eudora sat at the other end across from Ruth, who was holding court on some aspect of territorial law that she had recently studied, and was subjecting the Vasquez daughters to, with a passion that they seemed to find more entertaining than not. And the noise and the warmth and the smell of roasted meat and the firelight catching on everyone's faces was so fully itself, so completely home, that Eudora had to look down at her plate for a moment. She looked up and found Micah watching her across the length of the table. He lifted his coffee cup very slightly, a small private salute, and she felt the warmth of it travel across the whole crowded room. She raised her own cup back. 1987 was the year that Micah expanded the operation significantly, adding a second barn and contracting with a rancher to the north to handle additional stock through the winter months. It kept him busier than he'd been before. Early mornings and late evenings and periodic days that stretched longer than either of them liked. Eudora managed the household and the land accounts, and the children with the organized efficiency that was her nature, and she did not find the work burdensome, because work had never frightened her, but she noticed the tiredness in him and the weight of the expanded responsibility, and she watched for the edges of it carefully. She came to him one evening when he was working late at the barn by lantern light, and she brought him coffee and sat on the workbench beside him without making it an event. And he worked, and she sat, and occasionally they talked, and mostly they didn't. And after an hour he set down his tools and looked at her and said, "This is the best thing, that you just come." "Of course I come," she said. "Some women wouldn't," he said, "would wait in the house and be patient and not intrude." "I'm not some women," she said. "No," he agreed. You are specifically and entirely yourself, and it has been one of the great reliefs of my life." She handed him his coffee. He drank it. They stayed in the barn together until the lantern oil ran low, and then they walked back to the house in the cold, clear dark. And the canyon stars were brilliant and close in that particular winter way. And he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the world was exactly the size it needed to be. Daniel turned 10 in April of 1887 and received, as his main birthday gift, his own book of geological formations, chosen by Eudora from a catalog and ordered through the general store in town. He received it with the controlled intensity of someone who had wanted exactly this, and has maintained hope that the universe might deliver it, and he spent the following week making an inventory of every rock specimen he had collected in the past 5 years, which numbered in the hundreds and filled 4 wooden boxes under his bed. He also, that spring, began teaching Isaac, who was 3, about stones. Eudora watched this through the kitchen window sometimes. Daniel crouched next to his small brother in the yard, showing him how to hold a piece of rock up to the light, explaining in simple terms the difference between a river stone and a canyon stone, Isaac watching with the wide-open attention of a child for whom everything was still new. It was one of the finer things she had ever witnessed. Ruth, 15 in 1887, received her first letter of academic acknowledgement from a teacher in Santa Fe, who ran a correspondence course in law and administration. The letter recognized her study work and suggested that with continued effort she would be well prepared for the territorial examination when she reached the appropriate age. Ruth put the letter in the small wooden box where she kept important things, and she told no one except Eudora, and she said very quietly, "I'm going to do this." "I know," Eudora said. "You knew before I did," Ruth said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "I saw you in that kitchen reading Land Statute when you were 12, Eudora said. "A person who does that doesn't stop." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "I'm glad you came here," she said. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," Eudora said. "More than I know how to say." The summer of 1888 brought Samuel's 18th birthday, and with it, the formal offer of a position with a land surveying company based in Santa Fe. The company was reputable and the position was salaried, and it was a genuine beginning of a professional life that Samuel had been building toward for 3 years. The family talked about it together, all of them, and the general consensus, reached without much deliberation, was that he should take it. On the morning he left, with his bags loaded on the stage and the whole family standing in the road to see him off, Daniel gave him a stone. Samuel looked at it in his palm, a piece of red sandstone from the canyon wall, smooth on one side and rough on the other, and he closed his fingers around it. "What's this for?" he asked. "So you know," Daniel said, "that somebody's thinking about you." Samuel put the stone in his vest pocket. He shook Micah's hand and accepted his father's brief, tight embrace without pulling away from it. He kissed Alina's cheek where she sat on Eudora's hip. He told Ruth she was going to be the most difficult lawyer the territory had ever seen, which was the highest compliment he had to offer. And then he turned to Eudora, and for a moment she saw him at 12, watchful and unreachable, and then she saw him at 18, gone past that, grown into something solid and his own, and he said, "Thank you, Eudora, for everything," and he held out his hand. She shook it. Then she pulled him in briefly and held him for 2 seconds because he needed it and so did she, and he let her, which was all she could ask. He got on the stage. He was gone. Micah stood beside her in the road watching the stage diminish into the distance, and she felt his hand find hers and hold on, and Isaac stood on her other side with his hand in her skirt pocket, the way he did when something was big and he needed to be anchored to something steady. "He's going to be fine," Micah said. "I know," she said. "That's almost the hard part." He understood that. He squeezed her hand. They heard from Samuel regularly through letters, which arrived at the general store in town, and which were read aloud at the family table. His careful, neat handwriting describing the work and the city, and the people he was meeting with a contained excitement that was very Samuel, factual on the surface and glad underneath. He sent money home his first Christmas, more than he needed to, and a wrapped package for each of the children, and for Eudora a small silver brooch in the shape of a sprig of sage, which she pinned to her collar the morning it arrived and wore for the rest of the week. In 1889, Ruth turned 17 and began the formal correspondence study course that would prepare her for the territorial bar examination. Eudora sat with her through the difficult sections, not because Ruth couldn't manage them, but because Ruth had learned to trust Eudora's precision with language and logic, and there was something in working through a problem together, even when both of them were quite sure of the answer, that they both valued. Lupe Vasquez, who had been a consistent presence and true friendship throughout the years, came to dinner every Sunday now, and had become something in the nature of a grandmother to all the children, who understood with the instinct of children that certain people are chosen family as surely as any blood relation. Eudora loved her with a gratitude that was also simply love, uncomplicated by debt or obligation. Lupe had seen her through her first frightening winter, had taught her the land and the weather and the ways of surviving in a hard place with grace, and had given her friendship without condition. These were gifts that did not diminish. Isaac, who was 5 in 1889, had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision and Daniel's inherited love of the natural world. And he was also, unexpectedly, a child of tremendous humor, finding the absurd in ordinary situations and conveying it with a timing that regularly made the entire table laugh. He had his father's face and Eudora's gray eyes and Daniel's tendency to arrive at the breakfast table with something he'd found in the yard that needed to be examined immediately. And he was altogether one of the most irresistible people Eudora had ever known, which she recognized might be biased, but she did not think was wrong. Eleanor, who was 2 in 1889 and becoming more specific about herself every week, had decided her primary modes of communication were determined pointing and a single raised eyebrow that somehow recalled her grandmother Eleanor's reportedly imperious gaze, which her father found equal parts alarming and delightful. She adored Daniel with a completeness that he returned in kind, and she had learned, apparently from long observation of the household dynamic, that if you wanted something done you asked Daniel, and if you wanted someone to argue your position with someone bigger than you, you asked Ruth. Daniel, 12 in 1889, had become something very like a naturalist in miniature. His room was organized around his rock and specimen collection, his geological formation book bristling with paper markers, his correspondence with a professor at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, where he had written a careful letter about a particular sandstone formation near the creek, and received back a 2-page letter of genuine engagement that he had read so many times the paper was soft at the folds. Eudora sat with him one evening when he was writing a reply to the professor, and watched him compose it with the same grave care he had always brought to everything, choosing words with deliberate precision, and she thought about a 7-year-old boy finding a stone by a creek at dawn and carrying it half a mile to place it on a windowsill, and about how that same quality of deliberate, faithful attention had become this, a 12-year-old in correspondence with a university professor about geology. And she was so proud of him that she had to look at the ceiling for a moment. He looked up from his writing. "Am I doing it right?" he asked, holding up the letter. She read the paragraph he indicated. She said, "Yes, exactly right." He returned to his work. Micah came in from the evening chores and found her there with Daniel at the table, and he leaned in the doorway for a moment before she heard him, and when she looked up at him, he had that particular expression, the one that meant he was seeing something that he was going to carry with him. She knew that look by now. It was the same look he'd had at the Christmas table and at Isaac's cradle, and on the morning she'd walked the half-mile to his place with her heart in her hands. She mouthed, "What?" He shook his head, smiling. He mouthed back, "Nothing, everything." She understood both. By 1890, 10 years after Eudora Kendrick had stepped off a stage in Reed Rock Gulch with one trunk, and no particular plan beyond claiming her uncle's land and making something of it. The life she had built was large and various, and so entirely different from anything she had imagined in that first year that she sometimes felt the distance between then and now as a kind of vertigo. Ruth had sat her territorial bar examination in the spring of 1890, at 18 years old, and had passed it. The letter from the court office arrived on a Wednesday, and Ruth read it at the breakfast table without changing her expression, and then put it down flat beside her plate and said, "I passed." In the same tone, she used to report that the weather was clear. Then the expression changed very slightly, the corner of her mouth going up, and Eudora pushed back from her chair and crossed the kitchen and hugged her, and Ruth held on for longer than was strictly necessary. Micah said, "Your mother would be proud." And then, because this was the kind of man he was, "I am proud." Ruth said, "I know," without deflecting it, which was its own kind of arrival. Samuel had written from Santa Fe that he was engaged to be married to a woman named Frances who was, by his description, the most organized and clear-headed person he had ever met, which was about as romantic as Samuel's prose style got, but which conveyed, between the lines, something that looked a great deal like genuine happiness. The family wrote back with collective enthusiasm and immediate invitation. Daniel began that year making inquiries about the university in Albuquerque, guided by his ongoing correspondence with the professor, who had continued to write back with the engaged interest of someone who recognized a mind worth cultivating. The conversation between Micah and Eudora about Daniel's future and the question of university tuition was one they had anticipated and saved toward, and the decision, when it came, was not a difficult one. "He was born for it," Micah said. "You could see it in him at 5. At 5 he was leaving rocks on windowsills," Eudora said. "Even then," Micah said simply. Isaac, 6 years old and already carrying around a small field notebook of his own design, had declared his intention to be a doctor. He had reached this decision after a brief but intense period of interest in the natural world, followed by an equally intense period of interest in how things worked, specifically how bodies worked, which had been prompted by a question about why his knee had healed from a fall in a certain way. Eudora had explained as much as she knew. He had wanted more. She had found him a book. He was still reading it. Eleanor, 3.5, was at this point most firmly devoted to her own sovereignty, which expressed itself through a series of firm opinions about what she would and would not eat, where her toys lived, and the specific order in which people were allowed to say good morning to her. The order changed daily and was apparently communicated through a system no one else could fully read. Daniel could read it. He managed Eleanor's mornings with diplomatic skill that suggested a future entirely outside the geological sciences, but which was probably both. In the fall of 1890, with the canyon turning gold and copper in the autumn light, and the air carrying that particular sharp clarity that meant winter was building somewhere north of them, Eudora sat on the porch steps in the early morning with her coffee and watched the sun come up over the canyon rim, and she felt the fullness of the years settling in her like something solid and warm. She heard the door open behind her, and Micah came out and sat beside her, close, his shoulder against hers, his own coffee in his hands. He had a day of fence work ahead of him, and she had a day of account books and preserving and a letter to write to Samuel about his upcoming wedding visit. It was a full, ordinary day in a full, ordinary life, and she would not have changed a single hour of it for anything the world had to offer. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About Daniel," he said. "About the stones. About how the first morning I walked him over he asked me if I thought it was a good idea, whether Miss Kendrick would mind." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him," Micah said, "that I thought Miss Kendrick would understand exactly what it meant." She turned this over. "Did you know what it meant when he told you?" "Yes," he said, "I knew." "You used your 7-year-old son," she said, but her voice was warm with it. "I did not send him," he said carefully. I accompanied him. There is a distinction." She laughed, genuine and full, and he laughed with her, and the sound of it went out into the canyon morning and dissolved into the sound of birds and wind and the distant water of the creek. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He shifted his arm around her. The sun climbed the canyon rim and poured gold across the yard, and lit up the kitchen garden and the red barn and the wide, improbable, entirely real life that they had built together from a venison stew and a kept promise and 27 small stones. In the spring of 1891, Daniel left for Albuquerque and the university, carrying a trunk of books and rock specimens and one particular smooth piece of pale quartz that had been the first stone on Eudora's windowsill, the one she had kept in her small wooden box from the very beginning, which she gave him the morning of his departure wrapped in cloth and told him to keep somewhere he could find it. He knew what it was. He pressed it once in his palm, the same way she had when she first understood, and he looked at her with those serious eyes and he said, "I'll write every week." "Every week," she agreed. He kept that promise absolutely. Samuel arrived in June with Frances, who was exactly as described, organized and clear-headed, and also, which Samuel had failed to mention, possessed of a warm and generous humor that made her immediately at home in the household's various energies. Ruth liked her immediately. Isaac informed her within 5 minutes of arrival that the knee joint was the most mechanically complex joint in the human body. Frances said she found that genuinely interesting and asked him to tell her more. He did. The wedding visit was a week of meals and conversations, and the kind of easy overlapping life that happened when a family had settled into itself so thoroughly that new people fit in without forcing. Eleanor, who was 3 and had her own system, decided Frances was acceptable on the second day, which was early for her, and communicated this by allowing Frances to carry her in from the garden without protest. Samuel and Frances left at the week's end and went back to Santa Fe and their lives, and the house settled again into its particular rhythm, which was different now from what it had been, smaller with Daniel gone and Samuel gone and Ruth increasingly occupied with building a legal practice, but still full in all the ways that mattered. Eudora and Micah sat on the porch that last evening of the visit and watched the stars come out, and Micah said, "I keep thinking about all the ways it could have gone differently." "Different how?" "If you hadn't come," he said. "If Pratt had taken the land and you'd never had reason to stay. If I hadn't," he paused. "If I hadn't let Daniel walk to your window. If he hadn't thought of it himself," she said. "Yes," he said, "that too." She was quiet for a moment. The canyon was singing its night sounds, coyotes and wind in the creek's steady voice. "I think about what I was before I came here," she said. "I was smaller than I should have been, not in size, in what I thought was possible. I thought the story I'd had was the whole story." "It wasn't," he said. "No," she said. "It was just the beginning of one." He found her hand in the dark, held it. The story of Eudora Kendrick, who became Eudora Hudson in a small church in a canyon town in the winter of 1882, did not end there on the porch in 1891, or at any other single moment. It continued the way good stories continued, not in dramatic final revelations, but in the accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary days, lived fully and honestly in the company of people who chose each other. Ruth built a law practice in Raydrock Gulch that eventually extended its reach to represent families who had been treated the way Eudora had once nearly been treated by men like Pratt, people without resources or knowledge being taken advantage of by those with both. She carried the same fierce directness and relentless preparation into her work that she had brought to everything since she was 12 years old. She became, as Samuel had predicted, the most difficult lawyer the territory had encountered, and the people she served were grateful for every bit of it. Daniel returned from university in 1895 with a degree in geology and the professorial friend's strong recommendation for a survey position with the Territorial Geological Service. He took it and spent his career mapping and documenting the rock formations of the Southwest with the same faithful precision he had brought to everything since he was small. And he published papers and gave lectures and corresponded with universities. And he kept on his desk until the last day of his working life a small piece of pale quartz with a single gray vein, which he told every curious visitor was a gift from his mother. His mother, who was not his first mother but who was entirely and completely his. Isaac became a doctor. He studied in Albuquerque and then in Kansas City and returned to New Mexico and established a practice in a town larger than Red Rock Gulch but close enough for regular visits. He was, his colleagues and patients agreed, one of the most patient and attentive doctors they had encountered, which made sense to anyone who had watched him as a child. The careful notebook, the exhaustive questions, the insistence on understanding how things actually worked before presuming to act on them. He married in 1908, a woman named Rosa who was a schoolteacher with strong opinions and quick laughter, and Micah and Eudora attended the wedding with Eudora, who was 21 by then, and had developed over the years a personality that combined all the best qualities of every member of the family and several additional qualities that seemed entirely to be her own invention. Eudora became a schoolteacher herself in Red Rock Gulch, which meant she never went far, which suited everyone. She taught the children of the families who had been there for 3 generations, and the children of the new families arriving with the 20th century's particular energies. And she taught them all with the patient intensity of someone who understood that education was not the imparting of information, but the building of the capacity to think. She had, everyone agreed, her father's steadiness and her mother's precision and Daniel's instinct for the exact right gesture at the exact right moment. Micah Hudson, who had been 32 years old when a woman arrived in a canyon town with a trunk and a determination and an honest face that took his breath away, grew into his 60s with the same quality that had always characterized him. The kind of steadiness that was not merely the absence of trouble, but the positive presence of something reliable and true. He worked his land and maintained his fences and watched his children build their lives and sat every evening with his wife on the porch of the house they shared. And he was, by every measure he had ever respected, a man who had been given more than he deserved and had been wise enough to accept it fully. He said to Eudora, on the occasion of their 25th wedding anniversary in December of 1907, when the canyon was gold in the winter afternoon and the grandchildren, Samuel's children, were running in the yard, and Eudora was inside making coffee and Ruth had arrived that morning from her office and was currently engaged in a loud legal argument with her own reflection in the front window as she prepared for a case. "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "Tell me." "Every single day," he said, "every single morning when I wake up and you're there, it is still the best part of the day." She held his gaze. She had learned over 25 years to receive what he offered without deflecting, because deflecting was the old self's armor and she did not need that armor anymore. "For me as well," she said. He took her hand. They watched Samuel's children chase each other through the dry winter grass, their voices bright and free in the canyon air. Inside, Eudora called out that the coffee was ready. Ruth's voice rose briefly in the parlor, making a point to no one in particular. And from the shelf in the kitchen, where she had eventually arranged them in a long, careful row, the collection of stones caught the afternoon light, 47 of them now counting the ones from her windowsill, and the ones Daniel had given her over the years, and the ones Isaac had brought from his travels, and the one Samuel had sent from Santa Fe in a small box with a note that said he had found it by the river and thought she would like it, and he was right. 47 stones. 47 kept promises. The canyon was the same canyon it had always been, ancient and beautiful and entirely indifferent to the human stories played out beneath its rim. But the people in this particular corner of it had made something from it anyway, the way people always had, something warm and deliberate and real, built from the small daily faithfulness of hands that showed up, mornings that were witnessed, and the courage to say plainly, "I am thinking about you. I am here. Come back and you will find it waiting." The coffee was hot, the canyon was gold, the children were laughing, she was home.